to get it posted with the Presidio Heritage Trust. They have the ability. So I may be.
Well, take it away.
Okay. I wish we could all be live tonight. COVID continues. It's always been my pleasure with the PCAS. I go way back. I remember when PCS started their publishing in mimeograph. That was way 60s, I believe. And most recently published in the quarterly with a Good Fish, which is actually a dedicated piece. Mark Roeder helped me write that up for Rancho Los Cerritos. But yes, long been involved with the PCAS, to my pleasure. I'm sorry I can't join you in person tonight, but let me tell you an important story. I would pose tonight's program should be about the premier frontier diplomat, José Francisco Ortega, and his wife. I think women played a very important role, and I want to emphasize that. So tonight, I hope to present to you my own interpretation of Ortega and his glorious history. I say it's interpretive because I've actually titled this presentation Frontier Footprints, because I don't have any footnotes. In a nutshell, I hope tonight to inspire the many Ortega descendants and scholars all over that one of them will step forward to write the book on José Francisco Ortega. He deserves to be the subject of a major California book. Yes, Frontier Footprints without footnotes. Somebody should pull together all the footnotes. Ortega must have had volumes of papers, but they have been scattered probably all over archives from Mexico to Mexico City, to Baja California, to Spain. Nobody yet has assembled those papers. But tonight, with my own interpretation of his career, I hope to make the case that he was the premier frontier diplomat for Alta California. Actually, it's a pretty simple story. Fortunately, we know quite a bit about him and his career. We have his military formal record. We have some indication of his birth records, and a few odds and ends of reports that he filed. So the story is fairly easy to outline. Tonight, I hope to interpret between the dots and fill in the story in an interesting way to make the case that he was a frontier diplomat extraordinary. He really was. We can start at the beginning. He was born in central Mexico in Zelaya in Guanajuato in January of 1734. Now, it's important about his birthplace because Temple, in his quest to document Ortega, tried valiantly to prove the story of this man. He looked in all of the birth registers in Zelaya and couldn't find it. Then, frustrated, he turned to the other baptismal records for mestizos. And there was José Francisco Ortega. So it turns out Ortega had a native Indio's grandmother. And so he was technically, in those days, a mixed blood. Beyond that, the church records are extremely important. This was a silver mining center, a major town in early Mexico. And it looks to me as if for 4 generations, or maybe more, that the Ortega family lived and prospered in the town. My understanding would be, or best understanding, they probably were merchants. And when Jose was born and raised, he received an unusual education. That is, he was taught to read and write. He was taught to cipher and do books and mathematics. He was taught even political and religious law. He actually practiced law in his early career as a soldier. He often went before a judge representing various people. That is, he was extraordinary. I think he was from an extraordinary family. At about age 20, probably 1754, for some reason, he left his family there and enlisted. He enlisted at the Presidio of Loreto in Baja California. There, again, he was most extraordinary. He enlisted as a soldier, a corporal. Within 2 years, he had advanced to the position of sergeant. This was unheard of, to advance that fast. I believe he was extremely able. He was quick with all people. He was a diplomat. I think he was superior intelligence and was able to show it in various ways. One, he became Sergeant Ortega. That must have been about 1756 or 7. He is at the Presidio of Loreto, and that's where he got married. We know a bit about his wife, and I want to emphasize tonight many stories that we can build around Maria, his wife. She was actually born a Carrillo. Her father, Carrillo, was a soldier and was stationed there, but he was at a Cochimí village when she was born. So she was raised amidst families and children and babies that spoke Cochimí. So I'm imagining that Maria from the get-go spoke Spanish and the native language Cochimí. She went on, I believe, to probably speak many languages. Like José Francisco, I believe Maria was also a linguist, quick with language. Anyway, they had 3 children, and we'll pick up her story again in a little while. Because of Jose's service record, we know something about his military history. He served, and in Baja California, the Presidio of Loreto and all of the government was taken over and actually run by the Jesuits. This was the way it was. So José Francisco worked for, as a soldier, he worked for the Jesuits. This becomes important because in 1767, the king in Spain decided he would outlaw Jesuits from Spanish territory. The stories revolve around whether the Jesuits were making too much money and hiding it and saving it for the church. That may or may not be real, but the king decided, and all the Jesuits were to be taken out of Mexico and out of Baja California. And this was a major upsetting incident. José Francisco Ortega in 1768 was the one who helped organize that they should all safely be transported by boat to the wharf and to sail off back to Europe. So it turns out that he had a long Jesuit religious involvement. As I say, he started Loreto Presidio, 1854. He then in 1868 helped install Franciscans as they moved into some of the abandoned Jesuit missions in Baja California. He was all of those things. He really was a government diplomat. But some unusual things happened in his career apart from the strictly military. For a few years, apparently in the 1760s, he apparently stepped aside from the Presidio and he went out in the countryside in Baja California. There were a number of places that had silver mines. And in these silver mines, there was the need for organization, government, and rules. It turns out Ortega, by himself apparently, became elected alcalde for the silver miners. I take it this was in the southwest of Baja California. He was the alcalde, which is the equivalent of our mayor, police, and everything else. The alcalde is all powerful. In other words, he could get along with all the silver miners, the owners, the workers, and I suspect that many of the workers were actually native Kumeyaay. And Ortega organized and had the support of all of those factions. It was apparently in 1768 that the Viceroy came over from the mainland and met Ortega for the first time. The Viceroy came over from Mexico City and apparently had an audience with Ortega. The issue for their discussion was Galvez's plan to occupy Alta California. He wanted to create the grand expedition from Baja up to what we now call Alta California, our California. He apparently met and discussed the roles with Ortega. This is a critical meeting, and we know very little of it, actually. That's my interpretation, that they did meet, and what resulted is the organization of Galvez's Grand California Expedition of 1769. Here, we call it the Grand Expedition led by the governor, Rivera. And Rivera. The governor then at that time was, let me get my notes together here, Portolá. Governor Portolá was made governor of Alta California, not Baja, but Alta California. And this was going to be the grand expedition to explore and found the Spanish into Alta California, the Portolá expedition of 1769. It was made up of actually four or more parts. There were two land expeditions, or two major parties, and two major ships that sailed for San Blas to supply. They were supposed to all confer at San Diego. It didn't work out well, but it worked. Now, Galvez had met and wanted to make Ortega a key person in that expedition. I want to tell you some stories about that expedition. Galvez had made the plan that there would be, as I say, four major parts of the expedition. Lieutenant Pedro Fages was selected as the lead person for the military on one of the boats. And he's the one that first came ashore at San Diego, Lieutenant Pedro Fages. Ortega, on the other hand, was to lead the Father President Junípero Serra. And that was the second land expedition. It was about a month or so behind the first land party with the governor himself, Portolá. It turns out that the most important person is the president of the mission enterprise. So here we have Father Junípero Serra, and they're in La Paz and then Loreto, and they take off from Loreto to head north. And the man leading, guiding Father Serra is Don José Francisco Ortega, sergeant. They get started, and poor Padre Serra has a really bad festering leg. The story early in this expedition is that Ortega recognized that poor Father Serra was suffering. He could just barely stay on his mule. And so he turned to his head teamster, one of the men who had worked with mules and horses all his life. And he said, Father Serra's got a bad leg. What would you do if one of your mules had a bad leg? And the story is that the teamster understood that for one of his mules that's injured, he would make a poultice out of yerba buena and other herbs and things and plaster it over the leg. Well, the good part of the story is Father Serra much improves and goes on to have a big career in Alta California. One of the first things that happened on the 1769 expedition to start California's missions, they arrive, and Ortega knew the language, and he took them to the Cochimí oasis of Velicata. And there, halfway up the peninsula, Father Serra saw his first natives from paradise. 8 Cochimí men came into the camp, and they were dressed as if in paradise. They had no clothing. Yes, exactly. Father Serra wrote about this because although he'd been in Mexico for 6 years, he had never seen a native from paradise without clothes. It's a big part of Serra's journal. Well, it turns out that the very first mission then that Father Serra created was at Velicata. That was in May 1769. It turns out Father Campo was with them on the trip, and Serra stationed Father Ocampo there at Velicata. It became a major center for supplying Alta California. They grew vegetables and raised cattle. It was a grand stopping place with water and food. And often this was a major supply center for Alta California expeditions. Then in July, Father Serra had arrived at San Diego. Ortega had brought him successfully. They trusted that the Indians would not attack Ortega's group as they moved up. And as they moved up, they did encounter Indians, but there was no actual attacks. Ortega brought Serra successfully to San Diego. And in July 1769, Serra created San Diego Mission, the very first in Alta California. Of course, there was no line in those days, so this technically might be considered Serra's second mission, but it's San Diego, 1769, that's our first Alta California mission. When the Spanish had first come ashore from the boats, they had developed with the José Kumeyaay there at San Diego Bay, a understanding, an alliance of peace. But by the time all of the expedition had arrived, that peace was rather tender. There were about over 100 soldiers. There were over 300 horses stomping on the ground. There were cattle. And the Cossai people had taken umbrage at these uninvited guests. And so it was that as soon as Lieutenant Fages left to go with the mission onto Monterey, to found Monterey, the mission and the capital up there, it turns out that the Cossai warriors attacked the San Diego Presidio. Ortega was off with them. There were only eight soldiers to protect San Diego. It was a garrison with 8 soldiers and many people in the hospital. They had had much trouble, disease, and lack of food. It was a really bad time at San Diego in the spring, summer of '69. José Kumeyaay attacked, but it wasn't a standard attack. Somebody organized it. It was a strategic attack. Somebody knew that right after Mass on Sunday, August 15th, would be a key time to attack. Who knew that? Well, it turns out what had happened is on Thursday night and on Friday night, the local José Kumeyaay had gone out in their reed canoes and had tried to cut the canvas sails on the ship in the harbor. This upset the Spanish no end. They decided they had to station 2 people on board the ship, 2 soldiers. This means that instead of having 8 people to protect the camp ashore, there were only 6. Then on Sundays, when the padres went out to the ship to do their Sunday blessings and rituals, they had to have an accompaniment of 2 soldiers, 2 and 2. Now there's only 4 left at the Presidio encampment. And 2 of those are out with the horses, protecting the horses and grazing in the pasturage. So there's only 2 soldiers. Who understood that? I believe it was the José Kumeyaay chief. I think his name was Naguasaho. He already knew the Spanish pattern. I think he knew the Spanish language. I think he knew the Spanish church and weekly organization of religion and so forth. Because in my mind, I interpret that he was actually from the Rio Yaqui in Sonora. He was not native of the local, but he was a leader because he was an outstanding person from afar and could be a middleman, a judge for the José people. It turns out that when the first Spanish came ashore, it was Lieutenant Fages. He had just spent 9 months fighting with the Spanish in the Rio Yaqui country in Sonora. My guess is that the 2 of them, Lieutenant Fages and Naguasaho, said hello to each other in Yaqui because they did not want to speak Spanish in front of Costanzo, the official diarist. He was on the boat. He was a military naval officer, actually. He was the diary keeper for this part of the expedition. So it turns out Naguasaho was a most unusual person. And they had formed an alliance. But when the expedition in late July moved out, then there were very few, there were only 8 soldiers. And on this day, on a Sunday afternoon, they attacked. The San Diego garrison was attacked. The soldiers and those ill people in the hospital, and there were many of them, the Indians tried to strip the sheets from their bed. They were taking property, anything they could grab hold of. If they had tried to kill more, their attack would have been successful. But they were embarrassing the Spanish and taking all their property. So the first attack at San Diego is in July of 1769. There were deaths on both sides, but the Spanish used their muskets with success, and the natives, which apparently had more deaths than the Spanish. It apparently was a really bad story. They abandoned the polity that was José village, and apparently only a few families remained there. But the leadership had to leave. The Spanish had won the day. They had won José territory for that band of the José Kumeyaay. Okay, so the expedition with Portolá goes off. Who is the leader of that grand expedition? The Portolá expedition went the length of California, but the man leading it, the head scout, was José Francisco Ortega. He had been designated as the lead scout. That is, he was 1 to 4 days ahead of the main party, setting the trail. He had a very important job, and he trespassed through all the Indian tribal territories from San Diego to San Francisco successfully. How did he trespass all of that land successfully? He never had to fire his gun. He left some reports. In a nutshell, I think he did the following. Every day he stopped and he talked with the local people. Now, each one of them probably had a different language or dialect, and he would ask, where is the trail? And he would ask, how do you say hello? But most important, before each arrival, each day, he would hold out his hand and offer blue beads or white beads or a few red beads. I think everywhere he went, he handed out beads. This was his way. As a diplomat, tall on his horse, without his musket showing, he would offer his hand full of beads. That's a great way to say hello in any language. Offering beads. I think his name for the length of California must have been the Bead Man. What a diplomat. Yes. Well, the Portolá expedition was a success. They got all the way to San Francisco. They never found Monterey that first time, so they went back. They arrived back in July of 1770. And remember, the mission there had been attacked by the José Kumeyaay. They were still worried. And so it was that José Francisco Ortega was designated as sergeant to be in charge of the garrison at San Diego. So when the expedition turned around to again, second expedition to Monterey, Ortega was left in charge of the place that had had the first revolt, San Diego. So this is one more example of his diplomatic abilities and his recognition as a leader. I have just lost my screen. I'm trying to. Alejandro, can you fix me? Oh, there I go. Maybe. No, I've lost even more. Well, now I'm blind, but I will go ahead. Ortega then was the commander for the garrison at San Diego from January 1770 for 3 years as sergeant. And a number of good things happened that he made them good while he was in charge of the garrison. Let me go over them quickly. Can you get me on the screen so I can see myself?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on here. This isn't Zoom.
Okay. Just try to make me real.
There you are, dear.
Yeah, there I am. Good. One of his first jobs as a commander of this garrison was for the founding of Mission San Gabriel. Sarah was with him, and they went up the road, El Camino Real, and established Mission San Gabriel in 1770. It didn't go well, but it was established. They went up and down the road several times, trying to supply and build Mission San Gabriel. In September 1770, another incident. The Diplomat Ahachman at the Rio San Gabriel seemingly attacked them. We have one historical account of this. Father Serra says, all these Indians came out of the woods and they were yelling and waving their bows and arrows. And I thought, and this is his word, he thought his moment of martyrdom had arrived. In other words, he lost his cool. There was, in this case, Father Serra, one soldier, and a Gabrielino guide. This small party had moved out because they were going back toward the south, and the pack animals were moving too slow for Serra. So all these Indians jump out and start yelling. And that is the Battle of Topavit. This is in Orange County. This is September 1770. Now, people have been going up and down the road, and I suspect many of them have been trespassing along this road by using beads. Well, Father Serra lost his load, but fortunately, I think the real story is that the women had organized this whole affair. The Hotchman women at Topavit, I think, are behind this story. Maybe this is a new interpretation, but had they organized that their men should jump out of the woods when any party came by that was small and yell and scream at them? I think that's exactly what happened. Father Serra was taken totally aback. There was one soldier with one musket. Now, the Tongva guide that was with them understood the screaming and yelling. I suspect that he started talking to them or laughing with them, because I think he understood what was happening. Probably. The Tongva guide that was with them talked to the screaming Indians, according to Serra, and he got them calmed down. I think probably what he said was, hey, boys, I understand. Your women put you up to this, or something like that. Now, he turns to the soldier who, as one of Ortega's own men, a soldier from San Diego, had his saddlebags packed with beads, glass beads. Okay, here it goes. And so it is. Father Serra falls to the ground and says, okay, we'll give you beads. And the soldier comes up with his saddlebags full of beads. Now remember, these Stoyapet men don't have any bags or baguettes, plastic or paper, none of that. They're naked. They have never been converted. They have nothing as far as clothing. So, what do they have? I think their quivers would be containers. My interpretation would be that they held out these containers, their quivers. They put their arrows on the ground carefully and held out their quivers. And the soldiers and Father Serra filled each with 2 handfuls of glass beads. That's the end of the story, according to Serra. I think he missed something here. I think that night was a grand fiesta at the Topavit village. I think the women must have been out of their minds with revelry with all these beads, and that they had organized this. I suspect. That's my interpretation of the story. There were other incidents that Ortega was in charge of. In January of 71, just a few months later, he had sent 6 soldiers to La Brea tar pits. He had recognized the value of tar and posed that they should bring back tar for the naval forces. These would be excellent tar to help the sailors keeping their ships in good order. Unfortunately, Ortega's 6 soldiers were not good diplomats. Apparently, in trying to haul away without making presents, without giving gifts, they had packed up their mules with pieces of tar and headed out, and the Indians attacked them. These are the natives there at Los Angeles, La Brea. And there was arrows going, and it turns out that the soldiers shot and killed several Indians there in trying to get away. They did make it. And so it turns out that Ortega writes with certain sadness. This is the first time he's been in charge of any incident where Indians were killed. He wrote about it. I think that's an important story because it was one of the turning points for Ortega as a diplomat. He did something else. In October of 71, there was a Tongva revolt at Mission San Gabriel. He was able to put it down, or his men did. One of the captains of the Tongva was captured and beheaded. His head was put on a pole outside the mission fence. And that was the end of that Tongva revolt at Mission San Gabriel in October 71. Sometimes it really got bad. But overall, Ortega maintained a certain quality of peace in San Diego because I think he did something else. We have found one archaeological bone that is extremely important. There is one bone in all of the archaeology. It's a neck atlas for a huge Spanish Mastiff, a military dog. However, the Spanish Mastiffs are an extremely intelligent breed. I believe, my interpretation is that this bone represents an effort by Ortega to establish a military Mastiff at the gate of San Diego Presidio. And so for the next 10 or 15 years, the Kumeyaay would have to respect this giant dog, probably 4.5 foot tall, standing on all fours. And if it got up on its hind legs, it must have been 5.5 or 6 feet tall, looking down on an Indian. Now, interesting, if you look up Spanish Mastiff on the web, you'll find pictures. They are intelligent, and if their owners put them with a nice young child, the child just hugs the dog, and the dog is just an angel. I think Ortega understood a Spanish Mastiff dog. This is a kind of dog that was used by the conquistadores. So it's not unusual that a military man would understand Spanish Mastiff. I think his trump card at the Presidio was that he imported and had the family raise a giant Spanish Mastiff dog. Cuddles is the way I would interpret this, because I'm sure the children got on with Cuddles just fine. But if a senior Native Kumeyaay came with his bow and arrow in hand, I'll bet you the dog understood this was enemy. Enemy. And so it was. The Kumeyaay never tried to organize an attack on the Presidio itself. I think that the frontier diplomat and his dog, Cuddles, was a trump card. It's not in the history books, but we found one bone from Cuddles. I think it was a trophy that this bone was saved for a number of years and finally got into trash that was archaeologically recovered, dating probably from about 1820. But I think the dog had lived fully 15 years as the trump card of Ortega, the diplomat in charge of the Presidio. The next chapter is the Viceroy reorganized things. In 1772 or 3, it was decided to make San Diego a full Presidio. That is to raise its status from a garrison to a full presidio. And for that, they needed an officer. So they decided to raise José Francisco Ortega from being a sergeant to being a lieutenant. Now he could properly be in charge of a full presidio. So it was that he came from Loreto with his family to establish his formal term as Presidio Commander at San Diego. He arrived in August 73, and the official date for the founding of the Presidio was to be January of 74. They arrived ahead of time. Ortega brought his wife and on horseback their 3 children. 2 of the children were still very young, one just a few months old. They moved from Loreto to San Diego on horseback, about 450 miles, and arrived in August. And so it was that for the first time, San Diego Presidio had a first lady, a first lady. It was Maria Antonia Ortega de Carrillo. And her family included 2 brothers, Carrillo's soldiers. And so it was at San Diego, Maria Antonia Ortega de Carrillo established herself as the first lady. She had a number of important qualities that she brought. One of her babies was only about 7 months old at that time. It took about 2 months to make the trip. But she's then in California is going to have 3 more children that are baptized in the church at the Presidio at San Diego, and more later on. She lived a full life. In fact, as the first lady, we know that in the records of the church, she stood up 40 times as the Dama, the patron, to look after new baptisms 40 times. But she had many other roles. I'll get back to that in a minute. About this time, when they arrived, the first child, already Spanish child, had been born. We know that there was a child called Pedrito, born, and his death record indicates he's about 4 or 4.5 years old in 1775. So he was born about 4 years before that, about 1772. He's called Pedrito Fages in the record. Lieutenant Pedro Fages had established a relationship with one of the Native Kumeyaay women, and they had born to them a young fellow. He maybe had blonde curly hair. He may have stood out. It's a strong supposition, but I would interpret that he and mother probably were brought to the Presidio and raised the next few years right there. And there's even an earlier one. He has a cousin. And apparently, when he dies in 1775, he must have been born about 1769 and a half or 70. And when he dies, Governor Rivera says, "Mi hijo, my child, my boy." Did Governor Rivera also take a native wife? It's not officially recorded, but in Rivera's diary, "Mi hijo," on his death, on learning of his death. So we have both the governor and the first lieutenant, both apparently being taken up with Spanish women, or Spanish women taking up, Indian women taking up with these Spanish men. I think it was the Indian women who had a major role in this. And I think this is part of the alliance of 1769. And yes, there were children born. The 2 deaths are recorded after 1775. I'm getting ahead of myself. They're in the records. There is a historical record for this. My interpretation is that these were important young children, so important, they were probably raised by the soldiers and the Franciscan padres in the Presidio and in the church. And these 2 young boys are in the historical record. So the First Lady is Doña Maria. I think she had some important roles to play. More on her in a moment. The account and founding of Mission San Juan Capistrano is a grand issue for the San Diego Presidio. Mission San Juan Capistrano was supposed to be created in October of 1775. So most of the soldiers left the Presidio to go establish the mission there with the Hutchman up in San Juan Capistrano. That left the Presidio just underhanded. There were not enough soldiers, and the Native Kumeyaay could see that. And so it was that the Kumeyaay mission revolt in November of 1775 was successful. I think it was a strategic attack on the mission at Nipiquay. It had been moved from the Presidio itself up the valley 2.5 miles. And the mission Nipiquay was attacked. I think Naguasaho, who later was said to be the leader of that attack, did it as a strategic attack, probably with 16 men. There were 4 sets of men. One group was to go to the native villager attached to the mission and tell everybody to stay indoors, be quiet, do not come out. That's squad number 1. Squad number 2, quietly go into the Nipiquay mission, find Father Luis Jaime, capture him, drag him down to the arroyo nearby, and smash his mouth, his whole head with boulders. They assassinated him. He was martyred. This was a major turning point again. They then stripped his clothes and left him in the arroyo. The third group was apparently a group of 4 men, and they shot fire arrows in the thatched roof of the 7 buildings at the mission. Fire. By the time Father Fuster got out of bed, there was fire all around him. Everywhere he looked, everywhere he went, there was fire. He ends up with PTSD. Father Fuster, however, had in his charge, in his little hut, 2 boys, Pedro Fajes and his cousin. The 4th squad of probably 4 more men climbed over a wall and bashed those 2 boys to death. They were bicultural. And the Kumeyaay were proud and didn't want biculturalism. So we have 4 squads taking out 4 missions. Oh, I failed to mention the 2nd squad. They went into the church. They went into the church to steal the written records, the baptismal records, all of the records of marriage, and every place that had a name of a Kumeyaay, the book. They took all those books, took them outside and burned them. They destroyed the written records, the voices on paper. They destroyed the Padre's voice. And lastly, they captured and killed the 2 young boys, assassinated them. That's when the governor says, "Be he." And the rest of the fires raged, all the buildings were burned, and then within an hour, these squads disappeared in the dark. This was an outstanding revolt. The Spanish were taken totally back, and something extraordinary happened. 2 months later, they finally organized themselves and tried to capture and interrogate Kumeyaay around the countryside. They started to torture them. Tell us the story. They wanted the story, but 1,000 Kumeyaay had come together to destroy this mission from many, many villages. And they wrote out all these confessions. And the Kumeyaay apparently went along with it and gave them the stories that they were looking for, probably to avoid more torture. But it turns out there was not 1,000 warriors. In my story, I think there was probably 4 squads of 4 men each, and they did it all. 20 men in maybe 2 hours, the way this history is written. Fooster came back. They brought Fooster. He was still alive, and several other soldiers were still alive. They had not been, there were 4 deaths, but there were more than that lived through it. It was not a massacre. It was an attempt to destroy the mission. So it was. But the Spanish officials, the governor and others, wanted to write to the Viceroy and said, it was terrible. It was terrible. Well, the Viceroy decided to send 75 more men the next year and more money. That's what Californians wanted, more support. So it was a government effort to tell the story of 1,000 warriors. Do we see our governments exaggerating military stories? I think it was a strategic, small, well-conducted military assault by maybe 20 or 16 men. That's enough. They martyred the first padre, our Father Jaime. Well, it was up to Ortega now to try and keep the peace. And he did that over the next dozen years. There were several other revolts. He was able to put them down. They were all small, but he, in each case, was able to make the case. The Kumeyaay resistance at La Punta in August of '76, there was word that they were going to raise a problem. And so the Ortega brothers and some other soldiers went to La Punta down at the south end of the bay. And there was this one senior man. He said, I'm just here for trading for fish. I'm looking for food. He said it all in Spanish, by the way. Didn't need an interpreter. Well, they didn't like that story. So they captured and bound up, probably tortured, 2 young men. The first one said, you're not supposed to get us. He's the bad guy. His name is Naguasaho. He was in charge of the 1769 revolt and the 1775 revolt. So they captured another young man. And he said, the first guy told you the right story. They took Naguasaho to the Presidio. They put him in jail. And after he was interviewed, or they tried to interview him, Naguasaho never said a word. To the governor, to the Commandante, Ortega. And then Father Serra came in and said, I'm offering you the king's pardon and God's pardon if you'll convert and be okay. Naguasaho never said a word. 2 nights later, he was able to successfully, in his jail cell, hang himself to death. That's how we know his name was called Naguasaho. We don't have his Indian name. I suspect Naguasaho is somehow Spanish phrase. And as I said, I believe that you can understand Ortega as being a man of real Yaqui, an outsider who had come in and served as the chief locally and had led both revolts. So it was. Ortega had many other roles. There was a Puma or Pomo Kumeyaay suppression in 78. They actually burned the village and killed the guys coming out of their houses. A Hotchman had an uprising at Mission San Juan Capistrano in May 78. And then on the peaceful side, it was Ortega who was in charge of the founding of Pueblo de Los Angeles in September of 81. And then in December of 81, he was still in charge when over on the Colorado River, there was the great Yuma massacre, where they wiped out, killed all the people in 2 Spanish villages there along the river, 81. So for all these years at San Diego, Ortega was able to maintain a general peaceful attitude, although there were individual incidences of small revolts. Ortega's career goes on and on. He was next given the assignment to found in Chumash territory, Santa Barbara Presidio, and became its first commander in 1782. He was there for 2 years, 1782 and 83. He founded first Mission San Buenaventura, and then founded the Santa Barbara Presidio. The Indians, under his direction, constructed the water systems. This was native labor. This was important building the Santa Barbara Presidio. Remember, at Santa Barbara, the Spanish were deeply concerned that there were in the Chumash villages up to 1,000 occupants. These were big villages. And remember, the Spanish soldiers numbered just in terms of 10 or 20 at best for most operations. Ortega was there for 2 years. When the next commander came into Santa Barbara, Ortega introduced all 12 of the native Chumash chiefs by their first names to the new commander. I believe that Ortega must have quickly learned to speak Chumash and could make proper introductions. So he's getting more languages and more languages. He is offering beads and making successes. He was a frontier diplomat. Established successfully at Santa Barbara, they moved him in 74, and for the 7 years, he was at Monterey Presidio, which is right next to the where the mission president has his quarters. So he was at Monterey Presidio. He makes the rest of his career, in fact, as a commander at the Presidios. He served at Loreto Presidio 1792 to 93, then returned to Santa Barbara Presidio and was on the roster there in 1794. He had served more than 40 years as a military service. But before I get to his retirement, let me back up a moment and tell you about the First Lady, Maria Antonia Ortega de Carrillo. I believe she was more than just a First Lady. I think she was a very important person. I think she was in charge of taking in all the fish that were brought in from La Jolla to San Diego and distributing the food amongst the settlers, the soldiers and settlers. I believe she also must have quickly learned the Kumeyaay language. The most important artifacts we see at San Diego Presidio in doing their archaeology are potsherds of many, many, many broken cooking pots made by Kumeyaay women, native pottery. They needed those to cook. This was an important aspect of foodways. And I'm sure that Maria was in charge of the Union of Kumeyaay women pottery makers. I think Maria probably was in charge with those women to bring in all kinds of fruits and native plants, greens, vegetables. I think she was all of that and more. Jose was a good soldier, an unusual diplomat. But one of his jobs was to sign each year a requisition for all the things they needed for the coming year. This included, beyond all the military things and normal foods, rice and sugar, and a number of other important normal things for Spanish culture. There were fabrics of all kinds: calico, agrifolia, indinelia, silk, cotton. All of these fabrics were imported from Barcelona and Madrid to Mexico City. And what person would have known how much of each kind of fabric you needed? It would have been the women, and Maria undoubtedly established the customs and style of the women on the Spanish frontier, including ordering how many yards, varas of each fabric would be required for the coming year. Maria Antonia Ortega de Carrillo. I think she was in charge of all of that. I said also that she stood up for all kinds of baptisms. There are of record 40 times she's in the church records as standing up as madrina. I think she was an outstanding first lady. She carried that on when she went with her husband to Santa Barbara Presidio, to Monterey Presidio. Then he spends 2 years at Loreto Presidio. This is where her family was from. This is where Ortega started his diplomatic career as a soldier. I think he was actually a premier frontier diplomat. More than a sergeant or a lieutenant, he was a diplomat. Having served his 40 plus years, the Spanish gave him for his retirement a land grant, Rancho Refugio in Santa Barbara. That was in 1795. He actually had served over 40 years. However, he still owed money. The government said, you owe us money. So they made him sign a contract that all of the vegetables and all the produce produced on the rancho would go to the Presidio. This would pay off his debt, so to speak. I can't imagine how they kept track of money. He ended up with a debt after 40 years. So his retirement was conditioned. It turns out his retirement lasted only about 2.5 years. He's in his 60s. The historical record says he fell off his horse at the Indian village there at near Rancho Refugio, Santa Barbara. I don't think that's the real story. My guess, I would interpret that he didn't fall off his horse. He was proudly mounted on his horse and had a heart attack. He was dead before he hit the ground. They raced to bring a padre to him. He had already expired. That is the story of the premier frontier diplomat. I think the Ortega family, all of those who our descendants of this famous man should be even more proud if the story is fully interpreted. I think the story needs to be told, and I look forward to some scholar filling in all the footnotes. All I have is footprints. Don José Francisco Ortega and Maria Antonia, Grand Californians. I thank you for your attention and the opportunity to present this story. Thank you much.
Well, Paul, this is Steve. I'm back. Thank you very much for giving this presentation. I've always had a special interest in Ortega as a member of the expedition and the Carrillo brothers that he became related to through his wife. I just a point might make that that revolt at Mission San Juan Capistrano, he sent his, well, one of his brother-in-laws was the head guard at Mission San Juan Capistrano at the time.
Steve, can you turn up your microphone?
Well, let me see if I can wait to do that. My apologies.
Static is a problem.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, I have heard of that before. My guide shows I'm at 100% mode. So I will let that go then and leave that for other discussions. I'm sure you know that a tradition is to give a thank you and a certificate, which is backwards. I just realized that on my screen.
Big
But
thank you.
here it is, and we will get this to you. Another item, which we always give to speakers, is the letting you know that you can order any 4 issues of the quarterly. But you have been receiving the quarterly since its inception. All I can say is that we still offer this to you. I figure since you have had these for over 50 years, maybe if you have issues that are too worn to read anymore, we can get you copies of those. Or if there are issues that you would like to have that have your articles in them that you wish to be able to distribute to other people, go ahead and order those, and we'll be glad to send those to you for any use you want to make of them.
Let me say the next 4.
In the meantime, does anyone have any questions for Paul?
I have a comment. And that is that Ortega was the only officer that Serra did not complain about.
Ah,
He was at every Commandante except Ortega. He wanted to get rid of. He complained to Spain. He complained to Mexico City. He liked Ortega and recommended him. He hated all the others. Maybe it's because he fixed his leg, but that was it.
Any other questions? I would invite your questions because what I've done tonight is take little bits that are in the history book, various historical accounts, but interpret them, hopefully in a fresh way that shows the diplomacy that Ortega must have been able to achieve with all of the indigenous tribes, and indeed with Serra and with his soldiers. He did not have very much in the way of soldierly resistance. It wasn't perfect, but the soldiers didn't like to labor anywhere. So that comes up again and again. But he was able to keep all of his soldiers together. Are there other questions? Are there other issues? What I've done is go way beyond the history books and interpret how Ortega must have lived, how Maria Antonia must have lived, how the Indians lived with them. And the Kumeyaay apparently maintained a relationship somewhat like Serra had with Ortega. It was diplomatic and successful.
Well, Paul, this is Steve again. I'm not sure how well you can hear me, but one of your earliest points was when the Viceroy was first considering the expedition and went to Baja California. And as you said, he met with Sergeant Ortega. It just seems extraordinary that the Viceroy, you know, the substitute king in New Spain, would meet with a sergeant.
I think he met with an alcalde who was also the sergeant. And this is how successful Ortega really was. Yes, I think this is extraordinary, but apparently they did have a meeting. I don't have a good footnote that says what transpired, but I believe it did.
When I'm sure there would have been officers at the Loreto.
This apparently happened out in the, where I think he was being alcalde, out in the mining frontier, a settlement there. Yes, I think it is extraordinary that the Viceroy came to Baja California and was more concerned with setting up the new expedition. He didn't do that at Loreto. He did this, I think, with Ortega at a mining frontier town.
He met with Lieutenant Rivera also separately. So yes, he met with officers and a sergeant.
My colleague here, Dr. Alejandra McGillner, she speaks forth, and she has documented these first children. And we can cite some of her work with before in her lectures to the California Missions Association. But a lot of this is interpretive.
Why do you think it was the women who encouraged their men to do this fake attack on the priest, the soldier, and a guide?
They wanted beads and they wanted fabric. One of the things they took in both attacks was fabric. It was for the ladies. The Spanish complained that they'd take anything that was fabric, including the sails. But the first attack, I wanted to call his paper, Don't Forget the Milk. The first thing they did before they attacked Father Serra and the others was take the sheets. That was the most important thing. And I'm afraid that it's the ladies that wanted fabric and beads and things like that.
Let me double that. As far as I know, the Ahachman women did not have a written language of their own. So it's up to people like you and me to reinterpret the story of Father Serra being attacked by Tauapati men there at Orange, California, right after he crossed the Santa Ana River. But I suspect that the Tongva guide that they had with them understood the language just fine. And he probably offered, okay, you guys, now if you will, you'll get a better deal if you keep up this argument for about 2 minutes and then calm down. I suspect this Tongva guide understood the whole game and probably had a Tongva wife who knew when he got home, he'd also have a pocket full of beads. I suspect the women had much bigger roles than history has given them credit for. I'd like to hear some of the women complain about my speech. I really would look forward to such comments.
Be careful what you ask for. Yeah, question, Judith Swink, I see you've got your hand raised. You have a question, comment?
Yeah, good evening. Actually, I really want to go off on a San Diego tangent, but first I'd like to say that I've really enjoyed your talk this evening, Paul Chace. I live here in San Diego myself, and I'm aware of the excavations at the original Presidio up in Presidio Park today. And I wondered if you could make some comments about what you understand is being proposed for ADA access at Presidio Park at the Serra Museum, based on what I read in the Reader article where you were quoted about your concerns about this project seriously impacting unexcavated remnants of the Presidio.
Yes, the Reader article upset a number of good people within the city of San Diego. Yesterday, we had a special meeting of the Old Town Planning Group, and the District 2 councilwoman was supposed to speak. She chose to cancel and send her staff person instead. And he was told to tell us that the city is not going to do the naughty, that they are going to write an EIR about the ADA parking for the Serra Museum. That's a complete turnaround.
That's also untrue.
I believe that the city planning department is trying to put a good face on this now.
Well, I'm perfectly willing to accept that good face, and we need to look forward to an EIR, and an EIR that looks at some alternatives that I understand have been brought forward that would be far less destructive to Presidio Hill up above the parking lot. You know, since the ADA concern is to the Serra Museum itself. But because of the terrain, that's a very difficult undertaking, shall we say. And so I'm glad to hear that there has been that kind of reaction to the Reader article, and I will be watching what's going on.
Keep watching. I think we need to keep the pressure on. I think the city planning department has put forth the words that should be put forth. I want to make sure that they follow up. And I think we need to form a coalition of concerned people like yourself and anticipate the good and the worst that could turn as this situation moves forward.
Well, apparently, this proposed project was brought behind the scenes, apparently, over 2 years ago.
Oh,
yeah.
Over
Because
20 years ago.
I have a copy of the letter that Save Our Heritage organization wrote
yeah.
to the city expressing their concerns, and that will certainly, Soho will continue to pay attention. I'm a member of Soho. I'm also, and Alejandra may remember me, a longtime member of Citizens Coordinate for Century 3. And Alejandra at one point worked with me in the early 80s with the C3 newsletter. But I'd also like to, while I'm here, pump a little bit for Citizens Coordinate for Century 3. You know, the entrance from Taylor Street,
Yes.
that lovely green area with the ferns, and there's a plaque that from time to time is buried behind the ferns. That whole sector down by what used to be Chestnut Street and is now Presidio Drive and Taylor Street was acquired because of actions by Citizens Coordinate in the mid-60s. When the property went up for sale, it was at that time a number of old frame houses and a very large, big old liquor store and what have you. And so members of C3 raised half the purchase price and got the city to agree to the other half. So that was cleaned up to be a much more attractive entrance to Presidio Park. And one of the aspects that particularly pleases me is that one of the leading members of Citizens Coordinate in the fundraising was Hamilton Marston, grandson of George W. Marston, who bought the property specifically for it to become a park and to preserve it from development. Built the Serra Museum, paid out of his own pocket for the park design and the landscaping, and eventually 10 years later got the city to accept Presidio Park as a city park. So there's a lot of history there, and as you can see, I'm very interested in that broad historical aspect, and very concerned that the aesthetics of what's there today not be damaged.
The area that you saved turns out been able to identify as actually the site of Cosoy, which was the Native American village, and where the Spanish first stayed. That's only been recently identified.
Yeah, that I understood that to be the case because of some questions on a local Facebook group asking about water sources there. And apparently the village was situated there because there was a water source right at the foot of the hill, about where this green space at Presidio Drive and Taylor Street is located.
The San Diego River used to go by there.
Exactly, exactly.
Your comments are well taken, and yes, it is a big concern. In fact, that area at the base of the hill is the village of Cosoy. And
Yes.
if one was to look beneath the grass and the sod, you would find their house remnants. You would probably find their cremations and all kinds of archaeological food and other debris from the village itself. That is where you speak.
The ADA development requires you to walk, if you go both directions, 1/4 of a mile over gravel. If you with a rather steep, it's past the federal requirements for ADA steepness. If you can imagine taking a wheelchair or crutches 1/4 of a mile, 1/8 mile up and back on gravel.
Yeah, no, I think the whole proposal is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
You know, you can't make everything ADA accessible, and when you have such very steep slopes in a historic location, a historic setting, I should think it would be exempt from that in any case.
For those who are not aware, the San Diego Reader is distributed citywide. On June 1st, their online edition carried the story, "The Bulldozing for Preservation." And if you're interested, give me an email address and I will happily send you an electronic version. The story and the comments you make are right on point. This is ADA. I'm for ADA parking, but let's do it wisely.
Thank you for bringing up a current issue that involves the Presidio. It was founded by Ortega. I might note that we normally end these meetings by 9 o'clock. So to give anyone else a chance who has other questions, let's proceed with those questions.
Well, thank you very much for my opportunity.
I thank you all for the opportunity to present my interpretive story of Ortega and his wife. I think the Kumeyaay, the Hutchman, the Tongva, and all of the people who interacted with them, I think this is an amazing story. And because he was only a sergeant or lieutenant, but he was in charge of all of the presidios except for San Francisco. I think this is a most amazing frontier diplomat, José Francisco Ortega. I thank you for your good attention.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay. You want to close down?
We can sign it off.
And with that,
Stephen? Yes, there we go, to sign off.
and I'll just briefly mention our next meeting is September 8th. Don Laylander will be presenting old site records and a new perspective on prehistoric settlement stability. Have a good summer, everybody.
Thank you. You also.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Delva, I'll be home Saturday.